Hollywood, and history.
A brief history of the Armenian Genocide. Okay, so I suppose the one departure point for the story is the Ottoman Empire itself. So the Ottoman Empire began really as a principality at the end of the 13th century in what's now northeastern Turkey. What's the northeastern part of the Republic of Turkey. And over the next century and a half, it began to expand and gain larger territory at the expense of its neighbors, including other Turkic tribes. The Ottomans began as just one particular tribe and in this region. And in 1453, of course, the Ottomans capture Constantinople, the last holdout of the Byzantine Empire. And in the next century or two, the Ottomans expand even further. And in this process, they incorporate and integrate into its fold peoples of many different ethnic groups and cultures, Greek-speaking Orthodox peoples, the Bulgarians, people who will, over the next few centuries, develop national consciousness, but at that time still were in the process of, the national identity had not really come fully about. But Greeks, Armenians, Jews formed the largest non-Muslim groups in the Ottoman Empire during this time. But in the process, the Ottomans also expand into the lands that now form the modern states of the Middle East, including what's now Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and also parts of what are now Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, and Oman. And even, they expand even further into the Balkans and to North Africa. And so really the Ottoman Empire was one of the most formidable imperial states from about the 15th century until really about the 18th century, when in the face of a more confident Europe, it started hemorrhaging territory to its neighbors. And in the late 18th century, the Russian Empire really comes into its own as well, and wages several wars against the Ottomans, especially during the course of the 19th century, where I believe in just one, with the exception of one engagement, the Russians always emerge on top. So it comes to the point where by the end of the late 19th century, the Ottomans, who have been under the reign of sultans, their monarchs, are really on the, one may argue, were on the retreat. And in the face of this growing level of European aggression and by the early 20th century, there were enough people in the Ottoman Empire who were sufficiently alarmed by the empire's seeming decline. And these are words which historians should use a little bit, and do use with a little bit of caution when we use words, for example, decline. But if we, there was one group of army officers and civil servants who were alarmed enough to form their own conspiratorial group against the reigning Sultan, Abdul Hamid II. And in 1908, launch a coup and he's not immediately unseated from power, but they forced him to restore a constitution that had only been in place for about 2 years and had been in use for really, had been in place just 30 years earlier. So the constitution is widely heralded by the peoples in the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians especially, who over the course of centuries had developed a sort of symbiotic relationship with the empire, even though they were living in a hierarchical society where their religion was not considered actually to be the true religion, as Islam was held that preeminent position in Ottoman society for the course of about 6 centuries. But now, and especially during the 19th century, there were increasing moves by Ottoman leaders to bring the non-Muslims into the fold of governance. And for Armenians, there were a number of setbacks and frustrations where they felt they were unable to obtain the rights that they felt were due to them. And it really depended on where you looked at it in the Ottoman Empire. In the eastern provinces, where conditions were much more precarious, you had very contentious relations between Armenian peasants and, say, for example, Kurdish nomads and tribesmen. But by 1908, with the restoration of the constitution, there was this belief that the Armenians and the Greeks and the Jews and Turks and Arabs and every other ethnic group that this empire comprised could claim the rights that they were due, and do so in a way where they lived in harmony with their neighbors and under the banner of Ottomanism. And Ottomanism was an ideological framework which saw all the peoples as citizens of this one empire, regardless of what religion they belonged to or what language they spoke. But unfortunately, in the next few years, the Ottomans were unable to, at the very least, weren't really able to catch a break. So even though there were Ottoman Armenian members of parliament that were elected into power, and there were Armenians who also obtained positions in the Ottoman cabinet, the Ottoman Empire itself did not seem to be able to catch a break when it came to these wars that broke out just a few years later. So in 1911, Italy invades the Ottoman province of Tripolitania, which is now the modern-day Libya. In 1912, 1913, you have the Balkan states launch a surprise attack against the Ottomans in what are its remaining territories in the Balkan regions. And as if that were not enough, in June 1914, there's this assassination of the Archduke, which just a month later leads to the outbreak of the First World War. And by this time, the Ottoman Empire was under the control of several leaders of what's now, what was of a political faction known as the Committee of Union and Progress. And as we spoke a little bit earlier, Talat Pasha was one of the most eminent leaders of the CUP, as it's referred to. And at the time, he was the interior minister, and a few years later during the war, he occupies the position of the Grand Vizier, which would perhaps be the equivalent of a prime minister or the head of the Ottoman cabinet. And the Ottomans enter on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians during the war, the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers at least. And in the end of 1914, they, along with the Germans, launch a surprise attack against the Russian military and civilian installations along the Black Sea, and there opens up a new front in the First World War, where the Russians field a massive army and prepare to invade and occupy parts of Ottoman territory. And the provinces where this war was waged, in what's Eastern Anatolia, at least is referred to, and Western Armenia is it's also referred to, but were regions where the greater part of the Armenian population resided. And about 1914, it's quite possible that anywhere from about 1.2 to perhaps 2 million Armenians lived in the empire, but again, the majority of them were concentrated in this region. And so you have these two massive armies which wage total war against one another. And in almost every engagement, the Ottomans are bested by the Russian army. And in the face of several defeats, including a very large one by the Ottomans in December 1914, January 1915 at Sarıkamış, the Ottoman army suffers catastrophic losses. So several months passed by, and historians believe this was at the time when the decision was made by leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, foremost by Talat, to systematically uproot the Armenian population, because the reason they gave was that they suspected the Armenians were natural sympathizers with the Russians, and they would be removed from the war zone. Whereas, in fact, Armenian communities all throughout the empire, even those far away from the battlefront, were also uprooted, and that included the most insignificant of hamlets and villages, which posed no danger at all, and yet they were still targeted all the same. And so you had the Ottoman civilian and military authorities oversee the deportations that ensued. And at first, the men, those Armenian men who were already serving in the Ottoman military, had already been disarmed and placed in labor battalions. And so, in the words of one historian, they were like sitting ducks, and they were one of the first to be eliminated. And perhaps that may make a little bit more sense because, of course, the young men are viewed as the source of manpower for any fighting force. And so that just left the women, children, and the elderly and the infirm in the towns and provinces in the interior on the home front. And they were given just a few days to prepare their belongings and to begin on a march into the desert in what's now modern-day Syria, which is known as Deir al-Zor. And these deportee caravans were subject to attacks by Ottoman gendarmes, by Kurdish nomads, by anyone who saw the opportunity to plunder and essentially do whatever they would like, because this is where the state, in one sense, really failed its citizens, because it looked the other way, whereas it could look toward the benefit and the welfare, of its non-Armenian citizens. But when it came to the Armenians themselves, the state did not actually take any measure to protect them. Indeed, it was the one that was fostering this kind of climate and was encouraging these kinds of attacks, and doing so in a way which would give it a sense of plausible deniability, where once other powers began noticing, once there were Americans and Germans, missionaries, for example, and observers who noticed these kinds of measures taking place, the government and the state would be able to claim that it had no hand in it. In fact, it was trying to do its best to protect the Armenians. But again, the pattern was so obvious that you could see how all the towns and villages that were depopulated in the course of 1915 followed the same pattern, and that suggests a level of intentionality and foreplanning which the Ottomans had put into place. And these kinds of massacres and subjection to the elements, once these deportees arrived in places like in Syria, where the temperature in the summer of 1915 would reach 110, 120 degrees. And so you can imagine how civilians who've been deprived of any sustenance and ability to wear and to clothe themselves and protect themselves from the weather would succumb very easily to disease and starvation and other forms of illnesses and illnesses. And so this would go on for the next 3 years, and it would be not until October 1918, once the Ottomans signed an armistice with the Allies, because they began to suffer military reversals over the course of the previous year. But I think that's the best I can do under the circumstances. I think
Well, that's good.
10 minutes
Again,
maybe.
that's somewhere between a 10-second and a 1-hour version, right?
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can help by clicking subscribe and sharing it. And if you want to support the channel with a financial donation, there's a GoFundMe link in the description below.